I never thought I would tell this story. It's one of those things you don't expect to happen in your life, but it does. You never imagine that. A simple moment can turn into something that you can't take back. My name is Sarah, and I have a son named Ethan. He's a young man now, but at the time this story takes place, he was still in his late teens. For as long as I can remember, Ethan and I have always had a good relationship. He was a sweet kid, quiet, a little shy, but always polite and respectful. I thought I knew him well, maybe too well, and I thought I knew myself too. I was married, but life with my husband was, well, let's just say it wasn't fulfilling anymore. I loved him, but somewhere along the line we'd stopped being what we once were. The spark had faded, and no matter how hard I tried to reignite it, things just weren't the same. But what happened that evening? I never saw it coming. It was a regular night, or so I thought. My husband, Mark, was away on a business trip, which meant it was just me and Ethan. I had the house to myself. There was a sense of calm that settled in the silence, a silence that felt almost too still. I was getting ready to go to bed when I heard a knock at the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there stood Ethan, looking like he had something heavy on his mind. "Hey, Mom," he said hesitantly, his usual confidence not present. "What's up?" I asked, stepping aside to let him in. He was standing in the doorway, arms crossed over his chest as though he was unsure about entering. Ethan never acted like this. He was normally the type to walk into the room, lay back on the couch, and start chatting about his day without a second thought. I just need to talk," he said. There was something about his voice, something in the way he avoided eye contact that made me pause. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I asked, hoping I could comfort him in the way a mother always does. He hesitated, taking a deep breath before sitting down on the edge of the bed. "I don't know how to say this, but I've been feeling confused lately about a lot of things." Confused about what? I sat down beside him, concerned. This was not the Ethan I knew, the one who always had an answer for everything. Just life things at school, with friends, and well, with you. He glanced up at me, his face serious. "Now you've been acting different, Mom. Like you're distant." My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I couldn't deny the truth in his words. Over the past few months, I have been feeling disconnected. Not just from Mark, but from everything. I've been lost in my own world, consumed by thoughts that I never shared with anyone. It was like a fog had settled over me, and I couldn't seem to find my way out. "Have I asked softly. I didn't want him to worry. "Ethan, sometimes people go through phases. I'm sure it's nothing," but he shook his head. "No. It's more than that. I see the way you act sometimes. The way you avoid talking to Dad on the phone when he calls. How you look when you think no one's watching." I felt a chill run down my spine. He was seeing more than I had realized. He was seeing things I had worked so hard to hide, things I couldn't even put into words myself. I didn't know how to respond. Ethan got up and walked toward the window, staring outside at the dark sky. "I know I shouldn't be the one to say anything, but I don't want you to be unhappy, Mom. I just want things to be okay again." I watched him, my heart heavy with his words. It wasn't just the sadness in his voice that struck me, but the sincerity. He genuinely cared. And that made everything so much harder. He turned back toward me, his face filled with confusion. I don't know what to do." I didn't know how to answer him. In that moment, I felt a wave of guilt rush over me. Guilt for not being more open with him. Guilt for allowing him to see the cracks in my life. that I had desperately tried to hide. How could I explain to him that I was trying to find something I couldn't name? How could I tell him that I felt alone in my own home, with my own husband, even though we shared the same roof? "I know you care, Ethan," I finally said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but it's not something you need to worry about. I'm just figuring things out." He was silent for a moment, his eyes searching mine. I could tell he didn't quite believe me, and I couldn't blame him. I had become so absorbed in my own thoughts and struggles that I hadn't realized how much it had affected him. I had become a stranger to him, even if just a little. "I just want you to be happy, Mom." "You deserve that," he said quietly. His words hung in the air, and I felt my heart tighten. How could I explain the emptiness I felt inside? How could I tell him that I felt more connected to the idea of change than to the life I had built? That I wanted something more than just surviving in a marriage that felt like it was on autopilot? Before I could say anything more, there was a sound at the door. A soft knock. I turned toward it, my nerves suddenly on edge. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. It was then that the door opened slightly, and there stood Mark, my husband. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, stepping into the room. He looked tired from his trip, but his face quickly shifted into something more neutral. He didn't seem to notice the tension between Ethan and me. Or maybe he was just choosing not to. "Yeah," I said quickly. Almost too quickly. "We were just talking." Ethan shifted uncomfortably and gave a short nod. "Allah, go to bed now." "Good night, Mom." "Good night, Dad." Mark didn't seem to notice the abruptness of Ethan's departure. Or maybe he was too tired to care. "Good night, son," he called out before turning his attention back to me. When the door clicked shut behind Ethan, I could feel the weight of the silence between Mark and me. I didn't know what to say. How could I explain to him that things weren't right? That I wasn't the same person he married? That everything felt off? I didn't want to hurt him, but I was already hurting myself by staying silent. Mark sat down on the edge of the bed, his eyes searching my face. "What's going on, Sarah?" His tone was softer now, as though he sensed something was wrong. "I can tell something's bothering you." I didn't answer immediately. I didn't know where to begin. I don't know anymore, Mark." I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I feel like we're living in different worlds. I'm here but not really here." His face softened, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. "What do you mean we're fine? Aren't we? Everything's fine." I couldn't bring myself to answer. How could I explain to him that fine wasn't enough? That I had been craving something more, something deeper, but I couldn't put it into words without it sounding like a betrayal. "I don't know what to say," I muttered, my head hanging in my hands. "I don't know how to fix this." Mark leaned forward and placed his hand gently on my shoulder. "We'll figure it out, okay? Just give it time." But I wasn't sure if time would make a difference. Time had passed, and here I was stuck in a place where I felt like I was losing myself. I didn't know how to find the person I used to be, or how to find my way back to the life I thought I wanted. I lay down, turning my back to Mark, hoping the darkness would somehow give me the answers. I was searching for the next few days felt like a blur. Mark tried to engage with me, but I found myself withdrawing more and more. The weight of the conversation with Ethan lingered in the back of my mind. It was like a subtle pressure, one that I couldn't escape. And as much as I tried to put on a facade of normalcy, I knew deep down that I was unraveling. Ethan seemed different too. He no longer acted like the carefree son I had always known. There was a subtle distance in his eyes whenever he looked at me. I could tell he was still concerned, but I wasn't sure how to reassure him. I wasn't sure I could reassure myself. One evening, Mark was working late, and I found myself alone in the house with Ethan. He had retreated to his room after dinner, but I could hear him pacing back and forth, his footsteps echoing through the quiet house. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. I wanted to fix things, I wanted to make it all better for him. But I was too caught up in my own confusion to offer the comfort he needed. I decided to go check on him. I stood at his door for a moment, hesitant. What could I say? Would he even want to talk to me after everything that had happened? I knocked softly. Ethan, can I come in? There was a pause before he called out, Yeah, Mom. It's fine. I opened the door slowly, finding him sitting on the edge of his bed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't look up when I entered, but I could feel the tension in the room. It was suffocating. How are you doing? I asked, trying to sound casual, even though I felt anything but casual. Ethan shrugged his shoulders, slumping, as if the weight of his thoughts was too much for him to bear. I don't know, Mom. I guess I'm just trying to figure everything out. I don't understand why things feel so off between us. I sat down beside him on the bed, unsure of what to say next. I know, sweetheart. I know I don't know how to explain it, but things are hard right now for me. For us. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the floor. I just want you to be happy, Mom. I don't want you to feel like this. His words hit me like a wave, knocking the breath out of me. How had it gotten to this point? How had it gotten to the point where my son was trying to make sense of my unhappiness? I know, Ethan, I said softly. I want to be happy too. I don't know how. There was a long silence between us, one that neither of us seemed willing to break. Finally, he looked up at me, his face filled with something I couldn't quite read. Have you thought about what you really want, Mom? What makes you happy? His question struck me hard. Of course, I thought about it. I thought about it constantly. But the answer wasn't easy to find. How could I tell him that? I didn't know if I could stay in this marriage, that I wasn't sure if I could keep pretending everything was fine. How could I explain to him that part of me felt like I was suffocating, and the other part of me felt like I was on the verge of something different? I took a deep breath, the weight of his question pressing heavily on my chest. I don't know, Ethan, but I promise you I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to be honest with myself and with you. He gave me a small, understanding smile, but there was still an edge of worry in his eyes. Just don't forget about us, okay? Don't forget about me. I pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly, hoping that somehow I could protect him from the confusion and chaos that was swirling inside me. I didn't know if I was doing the right thing, but I knew I couldn't lie to him. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when it wasn't. I won't forget about you, Ethan. I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I promise. But as I held him in that moment, I couldn't help but wonder if things were already changing, if I was already slipping away from the person I had once been. And I didn't know if I could stop it. The following weeks felt like an unspoken tension lingered in the house, a pressure that none of us could avoid. Mark continued with his daily routine, his work, and his quiet attempts to connect with me. But I found myself slipping further and further away, unsure of who I was becoming or where I was going. My conversations with Ethan had become more meaningful, but they also highlighted how much we had both lost in the process. One evening, as Mark was preparing dinner in the kitchen, I found myself standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door to my room. I had avoided it for days, not wanting to face the reality of what had happened. What was happening, my thoughts were still consumed by the strange distance I felt from everyone. But this time there was something different. Something in me told me it was time to confront it. I opened the door, slowly stepping into the room that used to feel like a sanctuary. Now it felt foreign to me. The silence in the room was oppressive, and as I glanced around, I saw the small details that had once brought comfort. The family photos, the books, the little trinkets we had collected over the years. But now they seemed like relics from another life. A life that didn't belong to me anymore. The door creaked, and before I knew it, Mark appeared in the doorway behind me. His presence startled me, and I quickly turned around. "Sarah." His voice was soft, but I could hear the concern in it. "What's going on? You've been distant. You haven't been yourself lately." I couldn't find the words at first. I wanted to explain everything to him, to tell him how I was struggling with everything. The marriage, the disconnect, the feeling of being lost. But I couldn't instead. I just stared at him, unsure of how to begin. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. "I don't know if I can keep pretending, Mark. I'm so confused, I don't know who I am anymore." Mark stepped closer, his face etched with concern. "You don't have to go through this alone. We can figure this out together. We've been through worse, Sarah. This is just a rough patch." But it wasn't just a rough patch. It felt like the fabric of everything we had built was slowly unraveling, and I didn't know if it could be repaired. I didn't know if it was possible to return to the way things used to be. "I don't know if I want to." I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Mark took a step back, his expression hardening for a moment. "What do you mean by that? Are you saying you don't want to be with me anymore?" I could feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. It felt like the moment everything would shift, like the turning point in a story, where the outcome could never be the same again. But I didn't know how to answer. How could I? How could I explain that I wasn't sure if I wanted the life I had, even though I still loved him in my own way? "I don't know what I want, Mark," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm still the person you married." The silence between us stretched on, the only sound the quiet hum of the house. Finally, Mark sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I can't fix this for you, Sarah. I can't be the one to decide what's best for you. But I can't pretend either. We have to figure out what we want separately or together. But we can't keep living like this." The finality in his voice hit me hard. For the first time, I realized that I was standing at a crossroads, a point in my life where decisions had to be made, decisions that would change everything. As Mark turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the room, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the end of something, or the beginning of something else. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living in the shadows of uncertainty. I stared at the door, lost in my thoughts. And in that moment, I knew it wasn't just Mark or Ethan I needed to figure out. It was me. I had to find the person I had buried beneath all the confusion and fear. And no matter how difficult or painful it would be, I had to face it, because only then would I know what came next.